Jennifer and Jill had just finished watching their third scary movie in a row, and were still wide awake. So far this Halloween was pretty uneventful. The highlight of their night was when their landlord, Mr. Roberts, stopped by uninvited to do some work in their kitchen. The girls really wanted to do something, but the unexpected visit by their landlord threw off all of their plans. Finally, Jennifer had the perfect idea for this Halloween night they would be spending in. "Do you want to play Bloody Mary?" Jennifer asked with an excited glint in her eye. "You know I do," Jill replied, not wanting to be left out of the fun. They both went into the bathroom, switched off all of the lights, and began chanting, "Bloody Mary." Almost instantly, they both saw the ghost of a bloodied woman appear in their mirror. This spirit staring back at them was a beautiful young woman around their age wearing a vintage white dress that was soaked in blood. Jennifer really only wanted to scare Jill, but now the spirit of Bloody Mary was staring right back at them. The two girls were unable to move as they were frozen to the spot where they were playfully chanting only seconds ago, their eyes wide in terror. It seemed as if time had frozen and they were trapped in that moment forever. Jill grabbed Jennifer's hand and began to pull to get her to leave the bathroom. Bloody Mary put her hand up, motioning them to stop. The girls were terrified as they watched the woman in the mirror slowly move closer. Bloody Mary was crying tears of blood and looked horrific, but they could tell she was very frightened herself. Mary put her hands together as if she were praying. She then mouthed the words to them, "Please help." Not knowing why to this day, Jill bravely responded, "How can we help you, Mary?" The spirit of this young woman seemed agitated and pointed frantically towards their front door. Then Mary vanished from the glass, and a scene began to play out on the surface of the mirror. It was like a dream, hazy and hard to see. But through the fog, they could make out Mary's figure. She was alive and in her white dress. Jennifer and Jill could tell she was younger then and happy. Mary was alive and living inside that very same apartment that the girls were in. Mary was showing Jennifer and Jill her former life within this bathroom mirror. The girls were scared at first, but then they realized that Mary was just trying to show them something important. The girls watched as Mary gets up from the couch to open the door. It is Mr. Roberts, their landlord. Mary lets him into the apartment and he starts to say something but then stops himself. Mr. Roberts is carrying his trusty red toolbox. It is the same one that he had this afternoon when he was working in the kitchen. As he begins to lay down plastic on the floor, he is clearly there to fix something. Mary goes back to her couch and to reading her book. All of the sudden, though, Mary got up off the couch and walks towards the kitchen. As Mary walked into the room, she was surprised to see Mr. Roberts just standing there looking at her. But before she could say anything, she felt a sharp pain on the side of her head and collapsed to the ground. Mr. Roberts had struck her with his hammer. Mary could feel the blood pouring out of her head as she watched Mr. Roberts casually walk into the kitchen area. Mr. Roberts laughed as he watched her struggling to move on the plastic he had laid down. She watched as he moved the stove out from the wall. In incredible pain, she could see him open an access panel in the back. As he did, she seen a human skull fall out onto the floor. On the way back from the kitchen, Mr. Roberts stopped at her fridge and grabbed something to eat. Mary could only lay on the floor in terrible pain, unable to move. As Mr. Roberts returned to Mary, she could see that he had the hammer in one hand and a sandwich in the other. Terrified by how cold-blooded this man was, she tried her hardest to scream, or even move, but couldn't. He could see that she was still alive, albeit barely. Her eyes were glazed over and her body was bruised and bloodied. All she could do was lay there and whimper in pain as Mr. Roberts watched on with a satisfied smirk on his face. The last thing Mary saw was Mr. Roberts quickly raise the hammer in the air, then nothing but darkness and silence. She would never again feel any more pain. Jennifer and Jill watched in horror as Mary lay there helpless as Mr. Roberts brutally murdered her. The girls sat in stunned silence as they watched the image of a bloodied Mary fade from the mirror. They knew that she was gone, and they were terrified that their landlord, Mr. Roberts, might come for them next. Jennifer and Jill cautiously walked from the bathroom, each squeezing the other's hand tighter, and tighter. As they approach the kitchen, their hearts pounding in their chests, they notice the access panel behind the oven is slightly ajar. They exchange a terrified look before slowly making their way over to it, each step feeling like it could be their last. As the girls move the oven and Jill begins to open the access panel, they peered inside, not knowing what horror awaits them. Mary's white dress covered in dust and dried blood falls immediately to the floor. Jennifer is frozen in fear, but Jill forces herself to act. Jill looks through the access panel and sees Mr. Roberts' hammer and what looks like human remains. Jennifer calls the police, but before they arrive, they see Mr. Roberts pull into the driveway. Frantically, Mr. Roberts begins banging on their door, yelling for them to get up. He must have remembered that he left the access panel open. Jennifer calls the police and tells them to hurry as he is there at their apartment. The 911 operator can hear how scared the girls are and the banging coming from their front door. She tells Jennifer to get out of the house right now. Jill and Jennifer run out into the night, not knowing what will happen next. They are shaking and crying, clinging to each other for dear life. As they hear the sirens getting closer, they start to feel a little bit safer. But they know that they will never be able to forget what happened on this night. Jennifer and Jill had seen enough horror and excitement for one Halloween. They were terrified and they knew they had to get out of there fast. As they ran for their lives, they heard yelling from the house and then gunshots rang out into the night. The only thing on their minds was getting as far away from that house as they possibly could.